Hey, what's up YouTube? It's me again. So today's video is a bit different because this is Rationality Rules we're discussing, and I've been a fan of him for years. I guess I still am, but circumstances have forced me to make this video, so what can you do? Our job is to highlight reasoning flaws, and today I've found quite a few in Rationality Rules' backyard. Today's goal is to discuss what categories are, what something needs to have to fit a specific category, and why separating gender from sex is undesirable, nonsensical, and futile. But before we get to that, let's tackle some juicy points first.
Did you know that only 29% of philosophers accept or lean towards gender being biological? You know, the claim that
a woman by definition is an adult human female. A man is an adult human male.
Yeah, 29%. Indeed, more than 2 out of 3 philosophers instead accept or lean towards gender being a social construct or psychological.
So, Rationality Rules is trying here to force the perspective that philosophers are authorities in the matter of definitions, as if whatever they decide, that makes it so. In reality, pragmatism is. We define an empirical object based on its characteristics, and we build a given category with specific entry-level characteristics in mind for pragmatic reasons. How else are we to function in the world if we cannot distinguish between different objects and categories? What I'm saying is that there's no specific person or group of people that decides what goes into a specific category. Pragmatism does. So we're starting with an argument from authority right off the bat. The next one, though, is even worse.
Is it that most of those who study epistemology, language, metaphysics, ethics, logic, and social and political philosophy do not accept or lean towards the biological case that many, in fact most, lay people maintain? Well, if you ask some commentators, the answer is obvious. It's really obvious. It's because academic institutions are saturated with woke ideology, whatever that means these days.
Would you mind defining woke? Because it's come up a couple times and I just want to make sure we're on the same page.
So, I mean, woke is sort of the idea that this is going to be one of those moments that goes viral.
I agree with Rationality Rules here. If you can show one individual who doesn't know how to define a given term, it therefore follows logically that that term has no definition. It's exactly how reasoning works. Thanks, Rationality Rules. Now, before we move forward, I'd like to highlight an interesting discrepancy here. This may be just me, but I think it's worth highlighting. Rationality Rules uses castles, planets, and mammals to make his case, and these are empirical objects. But he uses them to draw parallels to gender, which isn't an empirical object, but an abstract concept. But why? Why doesn't he use abstract concepts like love, memories, or happiness as examples, but instead resorted to empirical objects? My theory is that by doing so, he hoped to add more legitimacy to the concept of gender. By associating gender with empirical objects, he tried to imbue gender with some sort of empiricism that these objects hold. So, gender would no longer be an abstract concept which is by nature volatile and maybe even interpretable and subject to change, but an empirical object of its own, not dependent on any other empirical objects, such as a body of a specific sex. This would eliminate in Rationality Rules' mind any doubt regarding whether someone who claims he's a woman is actually a woman. There's no mistaking here, the person is clearly a woman because gender is as empirical and factual as are castles, mammals, and planets. It's a category of its own, and the only entry-level requirement for the category is self-identification. There's nothing interpretable about it. I may be mistaken, sure, as this is just my theory, but it is an interesting observation nonetheless. But first things first, I'll jump near the end of the video for a clearer discussion setup.
The definition of a woman, like the definition of a castle, is an instance of a posteriori knowledge arrived at through experience. Hence, our definitions for both of these concepts are usually sufficient for everyday communication, but they don't encapsulate all instances of the concept they aim to define. And that's okay. The fact that we don't have an all-encompassing definition of a castle doesn't mean that we don't know what a castle is. That's right, we don't need a single exhaustive definition. You know what I mean when I speak about a castle.
Yes, but how? How do I know what you mean by castle if you can't give me an exhaustive definition? The same question applies to mammals as well. Rationality Rules has mentioned their a posteriori knowledge and experience as the main reasons, but what do those refer to exactly? My thesis today rests on answering these questions and building the case from there. But let's set the tables first and get a little more in-depth with castles and platypuses.
Can you provide the definition of a castle? Go on, give it a shot. Define a castle. Alright, I'm just teasing. Defining a castle is actually quite straightforward. According to the Oxford Dictionary of Phrase and Fable, a castle is a large building or group of buildings fortified against attack with thick walls, battlements, towers, and in many cases, a moat.
Just like Portchester Castle!
Hey Steve, got a small problem with your definition. It sucks. You see, it doesn't accurately describe quite a few castles, and perhaps worse, it entails that all forts are castles. But they're not. I mean, sure, Portchester Castle here fits your definition, and so too does this one, which is Bodiam Castle. Glorious place, by the way. But, this one doesn't, and neither does this.
I hear you. I'll come up with another definition, okay? Cambridge Dictionary defines a castle as a large, strong building built in the past by a ruler or important person to protect the people inside from attack. Just like Windsor Castle. Look at it! This beaut was built by William the Conqueror a decade after the Norman conquest in 1066 to guard against western approaches to the capital. And that's all she wrote. So, sure, sometimes...
Steve, Reese here again. That isn't all she wrote. You've made my other examples I gave you fit, which, good job. But consider Neuschwanstein Castle in Germany. This castle was not built to protect people from attack at all. In fact, rather than being built with military considerations in mind, it was inspired by romantic interpretations of the Middle Ages and the operas of Wagner.
Alright, fine. In most cases, there's always going to be some exceptions, but we can safely ignore them because they're so rare, right? I mean, why would we want to overturn our definitions for just a couple of outliners? Okay, look, let's broaden our definition. A castle is a strong stone or brick building. There, now every castle falls into my definition. Yes, fine, so too do schools, this office, your house, but as we say here in Old Blighty, every Englishman's home. Moving on.
Steve! Fuck. Not all castles are built of stone
I'm not
or
in.
brick.
Well, shit. This broad definition doesn't include many Motte and Bailey castles. I've made my obsession with an inclusive definition worse. I've broadened it to such a degree that I've stripped its utility almost completely, and still failed to be all-inclusive. So, learning from this, we need a definition that maximizes utility. That is, a definition that accurately describes an entity so that you, me, and the rest of society have a common understanding. But part of that understanding entails exclusion. It has to. If a definition covers everything and anything, then it doesn't...
Okay, I got a pretty good idea about castles and definitions in general, but we still have mammals to go through.
For example, mammals were traditionally understood, at the very least, to give birth to live young. But then we went to Zeus's alpha server, Australia, and discovered the platypus, a mammal that lays eggs. Truly, the platypus is an astonishing creature. It doesn't have a stomach, it's got a duck bill, electroreception, only one functioning ovary, and it has unique chromosomes, 5 X's and 5 Y's. Oh, and how can we forget? The males have venomous spurs because of course they do, they're an Aussie. But it's still, according to Oxford Languages, a mammal. It's a warm...
So, before I move along with my demonstration, Rationality Rules is right that mammals were once classified by one characteristic, which is the ability to give birth to live young. But what led the definition of a mammal to include other characteristics such as the presence of fur, warm blood, and feeding their young with milk from their mammary glands? Here's a hint. It wasn't philosophers, It wasn't experts in epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, language, and so on. It was pragmatism. We realized that animals that give birth to live young also share a variety of other characteristics which effectively place them into a category of their own, that of mammals. So, we created a category of mammals not because we wanted it, but because we had to, as a result of observation, pragmatism, and need for clarity. I felt this explanation was necessary. When it comes to mammals, a given animal needs to meet most of the requirements to fit its specific category. I'd say this applies to all categories, but let's stick to mammals for now. These requirements essentially are warm blood, skin covered by hair or fur, give birth to live young, and feed their young with milk secreted from mammary glands. The platypus is but one of the many examples. This animal may not produce live young, but it meets all of the other characteristics required by the mammalian category. It has fur, warm blood, and feeds its young with milk. These are fundamental requirements or characteristics necessary for the platypus to fit the mammalian category. Other mammals lack fur, such as dolphins and whales, but we still call them mammals, because they meet all of the other requirements. And then you have birds, for instance, which have warm blood, but don't meet the rest of the requirements. They don't have fur, don't give birth to live young, and don't feed them with milk. So, meeting one requirement isn't enough to fit this specific category. It's also important to note that the platypus, as well as all mammals, has distinct physical characteristics that don't fit this fundamental category. These have essentially no impact on the animal's classification. Here's what I mean by that.
Truly, the platypus is an astonishing creature. It doesn't have a stomach, it's got a duck bill, electroreception, only one functioning ovary, and it has unique chromosomes, 5 X's and 5 Y's. Oh, and how can we forget? The males have venomous spurs because of course they do, they're an Aussie. But it's still, according to Oxford Languages, a mammal.
Well, the problem is that neither of the characteristics mentioned here matter when it comes to classifying the platypus. It doesn't matter how a given animal looks and what biological characteristics it has, so long as it meets the fundamental requirements of the mammalian category. By this reasoning, it's absolutely mind-blowing that whales qualify as mammals despite having no legs and being entirely aquatic, which is almost unheard of in the mammalian world. So, I guess this makes the mammalian category entirely subjective, basically allowing anything in so long as let's say, a philosopher likes to put it there, right? Well, wrong. The fact that the whale has no legs and is aquatic bears no significance, so long as the animal meets the fundamental requirements of the mammalian category. The exact same goes for the platypus. I think what the Irrationality Rules is trying to do here is say, hey, look how wildly different this mammal is from other mammals. So you see, you can diverge a lot from the norm and still fit the category. Why would we apply a different standard to women? Why does a woman need to be female to classify as a woman? Just like the platypus, it's okay if the individual diverges wildly from the norm, like, for instance, being a male. We should still include it in the woman category based on gender identity. And he does this to push the idea that trans women are women. And if you think I'm reading too much into this, I'm not. What I just said is the entire goal of Irrationality Rules' video, isn't it? Now let's move to castles and see how they fare when it comes to the notion of fundamental characteristics. They are massive constructions, have fortified walls to protect against attacks, are built by and or occupied by a king or a royal family, are meant to protect high-profile figures from invaders, are typically surrounded by a moat for defensive purposes, have components like battlements, turrets, embrasures, portcullises, and so on. A modern-day apartment block is a massive construction, so it meets one requirement on the list, but not the rest of them. A bunker is fortified and meant to protect high-profile figures, but again, doesn't meet the rest of the requirements. It's also built underground, which is a core requirement for reinforced construction to qualify as a bunker. Castles are above ground. If you can't see where I'm going with this, allow me to explain. Castles, mammals, and anything else you can think of qualify as empirical objects that fall into specific categories. Some categories are more loosely defined than others, but they do have limits to what they allow in. This cannot qualify as a castle, and neither can this. I don't know what this is, but I'm pretty sure it's not a castle. Important point here, I guess they could qualify as such, provided you change the entry-level requirements for something to be defined as a castle. But this would entail stretching the definition of a castle so much that the entire category changes entirely. And the goal is to keep the category because castles are specific things that don't change simply because you change their category. So you'll only create confusion for the sake of it. But hold on, Atypical. If you say that something can still fit its respective category despite not meeting all of the fundamental requirements, can't we apply this to trans women as well? Can they join the woman category too despite not meeting one requirement, which is to be a female? Well, no, because the woman category only has that one requirement. Not meeting it is the same as not meeting any of the fundamental requirements of the mammalian category, but still fit the category. This second point follows the first one in terms of importance, but it's still critical as an identification marker. To put it simply, you cannot define something without any form of visual input. If you don't know what fur, beaks, legs, ducks, beavers, tails, and otters are and how they look like, you cannot understand and visualize a platypus. It doesn't matter how exhaustively semantic the definition tries to be. This is what Irrationality Rules means when he says,
The definition of a woman, like the definition of a castle, is an instance of a posteriori knowledge arrived at through experience. The fact that we don't have an all-encompassing definition of a castle doesn't mean that we don't know what a castle is.
However, the visuals only play a secondary role here, because a given empirical object might not look like it belongs to a given category when in fact it does. I come back to whales and dolphins, which look like they're fish and bear no visual resemblance to the typical mammal, but they're mammals nonetheless. So, two of our initial points are laid out. Categories are classes of things that share specific characteristics, and a thing needs to meet several of the entry-level requirements to fall in a given category. Based on these 2 points, it results that the category of woman also has some entry-level requirements, the most important of all being biology, which means male cannot join in. Okay, so what was the point of my demonstration? Consider the following clip to better understand where I'm coming from.
They're an Aussie, but it's still, according to Oxford Languages, a mammal. It's a warm-blooded vertebrate animal of a class that is distinguished by the possession of hair or fur, females that secrete milk for the nourishment of the young, and, typically, the birth of live young. Indeed, did you see what happened there? The word typically is allowing for the exceptions. The definition of a mammal, a fundamental category, was changed to accommodate monotremes, and yet civilization didn't crumble.
This is a misrepresentation of what the word typically does there. It doesn't allow for exceptions to the category, but for exceptions to that one specific requirement, the ability to produce live young. You may have had a point if we would have seen the word typically next to each requirement instead of just one. My point is that it seems like Irrationality Rules is mistaking the slice for the cake here. In his view, if a given object skips at least one entry-level requirement to the category, but still fits the category, then categories are subjective and we can include any object in any category even if they don't meet any requirement. And it's even more obvious that that's his point when considering that he leaves definitions to philosophers instead of pragmatism. I hope my demonstration has showed that that's not the case. So we now have the last point to tackle, which is separating gender from sex is undesirable, nonsensical, and futile. Before we get to the meat of my argument, I have a few more points to touch on.
Western civilization. Similarly, the definition of female has evolved significantly over the last 100 years. We once defined it as genitalia, then moved towards chromosomes, and now...
Yes, but do you know why the definition of a female has changed? It's because our understanding of the empirical concept, aka female, has changed. We kept going deeper from external genitalia to gametes to chromosomes in an attempt to get an as clear of a definition as possible. We understood with time that it's not merely the genitalia that define a female, but a cohort of many other biological characteristics. So our definition of a female has changed to accommodate our deeper and clearer understanding of the notion itself. However, no matter the markers we considered as representative for the female sex, the empirical concept itself remained unchanged. No matter how we defined females, females remained females. The definition changing didn't change the nature of the empirical concept. It simply added more clarity to it. So, for instance, we simply couldn't qualify females by their genitalia alone when bottom surgeries became possible, because that meant introducing males in the female category as well, once they resorted to the intervention. To preserve the category of female, we needed more clarity, which required us to go more in-depth and look for additional markers that would keep the male and female categories separate, which is how we got the chromosomes, for instance, and so on.
When it comes to empirical entities, definitions are often not all-encompassing, and that's perfectly acceptable. But if we are to recognize this, and we should, then we can't apply this recognition inconsistently. We can't insist that when it comes to some empirical concepts, we don't need an all-encompassing definition, such as castles, cars, art, mountains, rivers, leaflets, music, health, education, love, prayer, race, beauty, and so on. But when it comes to other empirical concepts, we do need an all-encompassing definition, such as woman.
This is another misrepresentation. In reality, this stance is consistent. We do want definitions to be as all-encompassing as possible, whether we're talking about castles, cars, love, you have it. This is for the purpose of having more clarity, less confusion, and clearer distinction between the different categories. The goal is the same regardless of the category. The difference is that some categories are easier to define and thus are more well-defined than others. Some concepts have a more all-encompassing definition if you wish, such as the notion of a woman, which originally referred to female. It doesn't get more all-encompassing than that unless you claim that the definition of a female isn't all-encompassing, but I doubt you'll go there, because that category no longer falls under the guise of semantics and wordplay when it comes to defining it, but that of biology.
No, what's more pressing is that the definition of, for instance, a woman being an adult human female simply outsources the definition to two other terms, adult and female. And yet, both of these terms suffer from many of the same issues that the word woman and castle do. The cultural construct of adulthood varies significantly across cultures and has historically been different within just Western civilization. Similarly, the definition of female has evolved significantly over the last 100 years. We once defined it as genitalia, then moved towards chromosomes.
Yes, and the definition of a platypus outsources the definition to words like semi-aquatic, egg-laying, and mammal, to name a few. I guess the definition is entirely subjective and relative because it contains words, I guess. This is how language works, though. You use some words to define other words, and the words you've used in the process have their own definitions and mean specific things. Whether they have exhaustive or otherwise definitions, it bears no difference. What matters is that they're precise enough to convey as precise of a meaning as possible to distinguish between different empirical categories. We can argue about the relativity of the notion of an adult because the definition is partly subjective and partly objective, not entirely subjective as you seem to imply here. I agree that different cultures have different thresholds for adulthood, but nowhere in the world, in any historical time, have 2-year-olds been considered adults, right? So there must be some objective assessment there. We've already addressed the female part. So I assume you would agree that the more all-encompassing a given definition, the better. because it conveys more precise meaning. By this reasoning, the definition of a woman is an adult human female does convey more precise meaning than a woman is someone who identifies as a woman. And you trying to poke holes in the terms forming the definition, adult and female, only shows desperation to reject the idea of some terms having more comprehensive definitions than others. This is even more obvious if we consider that you've pointed out the words adult and female as being problematic in a definition, but you didn't say anything about the word human. The word human is also part of the definition. You can see it right here. Surely you don't think that the word human is actually exhaustive and doesn't have any semantic malleability, do you? Because that would mean you would be forced to accept that some definitions actually are all-encompassing and accept pretty much no variation, like that of a human, or that of a female, and I would argue that of a woman. But if you don't think that, then it makes no sense why you wouldn't mention human alongside adult and female in your example, right? So my stance is this: a woman is defined as an adult human female, a definition which requires the subject to be a female. And the definition of a female is fairly all-encompassing as it relies on biological markers as entry-level requirements. As I've already explained, we initially relied on visuals to determine sex, aka assess the person's appearance, the existence of sex-specific genitalia, etc. As these markers became unreliable with time, we moved to more unbending markers like chromosomes and gametes. The category stays. Okay, atypical, but your entire case rests on sex and gender being synonymous, whereas Rationality Rules' point is that they're separate, so that gender is a category of its own. This means that your demonstration doesn't even address this case. Fair point, but do you know why I took this approach? Because my thesis is that you cannot separate gender from sex. You cannot define them as separate categories completely unrelated. Not that you shouldn't, but that you can't. Here's what I mean by that.
This episode drops. Now, if there's one thing I really hope I've made clear in this episode, it's that when it comes to empirical entities, it's often the case that there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all definition. That's just not how empirically based definitions roll, at least not most of the time. They're not about laying down the law, they're about describing things. And when it comes to definitions based on real-world stuff, those definitions are liable to change as and when our understanding expands. This is what happened with our definition of a mammal, and a planet, and, indeed, a woman. Yeah, that's a trans-inclusive definition from Cambridge Dictionary, no less. It's one of the few definitions of a woman that they acknowledge.
Okay, so if this is your example of a good definition for what a woman is, I have bad news. You don't agree with it. Not that I don't agree with it, you don't either. There's simply no way you do. Tell me, Rationality Rules, how do females live and what does it mean to identify as a female? Let me explain the problem. When you say that females live a certain way, you inadvertently refer to their behavior, personality, lifestyle, overall persona, maybe social role, and so on. But I thought that's what makes a woman, not a female, right? Don't you claim that sex is different from gender and that the sex, so the notion of a female, only refers to the body's biology, whereas the gender refers to everything else like behavior, personality, psychological makeup, and so on? By this reasoning, nobody can live, behave, or identify as a female. They can only live and behave as a woman. Given these facts, the definition really is a woman is an adult who lives and identifies as a woman, though they may have been said to have a different gender at birth, which in even fewer and clearer terms becomes a woman is someone who identifies as a woman. And I'm pretty sure you've heard this one before. Here's another interesting thought relating to this point. Where does this confusion stems from? I think it comes from the fact that even those who have created this inclusive definition associate the notion of a woman with that of a female in their heads. When they think of a female, they immediately link a specific behavioral and psychological makeup to the notion. So they associate the notion of a womanhood to that of females, which is one of the biggest cell phones I've ever seen on the subject, because it shows me that not even experts in the gender matter cannot define gender without linking it to biology. So when you say that...
Those who insist on an all-encompassing definition are playing tennis without the net, since they do not hold the standard for all other empirical definitions. When the likes of Ben Shapiro, Piers Morgan and Matt Walsh pat themselves on the back because they've pointed out that the left woke people don't have some unifying definition on what is a woman, it's cringe enough. But when they confidently and mockingly insist that they have the correct definition, it's philosophical turbo cringe.
You misrepresent what they're saying, intentionally or otherwise. It's not that they say that their definition of a woman is better than yours or is the correct one. No. They're actually saying that they have a definition for woman, whereas you don't. Their point is that you cannot define what a woman is absent of sex. In other words, that you're unjustifiably trying to create a new category, that of gender absent of sex, but you cannot define gender absent of sex, as I believe I've already proven. All your definitions are either nonsensical or circular, which is to say they're not valid. And by all definitions, I mean the only one you've provided so far. So, coming back to the original point, separating gender from sex is undesirable, nonsensical, and futile. It's nonsensical because on the one hand you cannot define gender absent of sex, and it's futile because even if you do separate them and ignore any trace of common sense and reasoning, you'll get nowhere. Here, I'll play the devil's advocate here. You can have your woman. From now on, all trans women are women. But the category of trans women will now contain both males and females. And we still need a different name for the initial category, a woman who is also a female. Why? Well, for a multitude of reasons. Sports is one of them, where biology plays a critical role. Another one is job profile. Some jobs benefit more from male employees, especially those that rely on heavy physical work. Others, like nursing or customer service, may require a female's presence. And by the way, this sex-based organization of society also makes it undesirable to create a mixed category, if you know what I mean. And if you think trans women are women, it means you don't agree with separations based on sex. Because if I say I need a female for a nursing job because females are more caring and empathetic, your argument will be, nah, it's women who are like that, not females, you bigot. And women can be both males or females. Why you discriminate? And I think nobody wants that convo. I won't expand too much on this subject because I don't want to make this a 3-hour video, but you get the point. So, we'll call those female women cis women. I'm fine with that. I don't get the point because then everybody will need to become accustomed to the new terms, but okay. The problem is that you have achieved nothing anyway. We have just circled back to where we initially started. Because your trans women are now women, but they're not cis women. So then the slogan will change to trans women are cis women, and the semantic war will keep raging on. Then we have the following inflammatory but completely valid idea. Given that woman is just an idea or an identity that can appear both in a female and a male brain, what exactly is the difference between a male who envisions himself as being a woman and one who envisions himself as being a dog? Sure, you can argue that dogs are biological creatures and the male in question is a human, but the male doesn't claim he's a biological dog, does he? He's claiming he has the identity of one. This means that he behaves as one without actually being one. Isn't what trans women are doing as well? So he embraces the identity of a dog the same way the other male embraces that of a woman. What exactly is the difference between the two? Why is one valid but the other not? Don't get me wrong here. I don't try to appear insulting, trivialize the matter, or make trans people seem crazy. This is honestly not my goal here. I'm just pointing out a visible and glaring, at least to me, similarity between the two concepts. One that's inflammatory enough to set people ablaze, but not enough to compel them to try to explain it. So, to summarize, you cannot define what a woman is without linking it to biology. This means that males cannot qualify as women because males cannot become females. Therefore, trans women are not and cannot become women. Forcing the issue and calling trans women women anyway won't change reality. It will only add confusion, as you'll now have two categories that are called the same but are defined differently. Plus, to close on a high note, trans women already have their own category, which is trans women, males who behave like females, or men who behave like women, take your pick. What's wrong with that exactly? Okay, so I hope my video didn't trigger anyone too much, because it's not meant to. This is just an exercise of cold reasoning and logic, no feelings involved in the process. If you like the content, sub, comment, support my work, and more work will come. A closing idea here. Rationality Rules is supposed to make a series on this topic, this being the first of several videos to come. I may or may not tackle his series in its entirety depending on the arguments he's presenting, because if I've already addressed all of his future points with this one video, there's no point in beating the dead horse with a series of my own. But then again, I may need to. We'll see, I guess. Peace.